The nervous system is one of two regulatory systems of the body, the other being the endocrine system. The nervous system reacts to changes in the environment. When the environment changes, the nervous system signals the body that change has occurred and affects change on your body systems. This way, it keeps your body in a sense of balance or in a state of homeostasis. Slight fluctuations above or below what is normal are common. Our systems are in a state of dynamic equilibrium, continuously adjusting to manage the exterior environment. So homeostasis then involves the maintenance of a constant internal environment. The nervous system collects information about external conditions in relation to the body's internal state. The organization of the nervous system occurs like this. You have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system integrates and processes information sent by the nerves. The peripheral nervous system carries sensory messages to the central nervous system and from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. The central nervous system can be divided into two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can also be subdivided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. For the first part of this chapter, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system and the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. The somatic nerves can be divided into sensory nerves and motor nerves. Sensory nerves attached to sensory receptors convey information about the environment to the central nervous system. Motor nerves send responding information to skeletal muscle cells, or effector cells. Autonomic nerves can be divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves work in opposition to regulate the involuntary body processes. In this slide from your textbook, we can see a photograph of a nerve cell in image A. Image B is also a photograph of a cross-section of a nerve cell. But ignoring for the labels just for the moment, let's have a look at the central image there. Nerves are really collections of cells, neurons and support cells, that is organized into tissue. Neurons are the basic structural and functional units of nerves. The support cells would be the glial cells, cells that support the activity of the neuron. Schwann cells in this diagram, for example, and astrocytes and so forth. They can nourish neurons, remove their waste, and defend against infection. So nerves are neurons and glial cells organized into tissue. Neurons, the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Neurons are highly specialized, that is, very limited in cell division capacity. They're designed to conduct electrochemical signals and release chemicals called neurotransmitters. The glial cells nourish the neurons, remove their waste, and defend against infection. They also provide a supporting framework for all the nervous system tissue. Neurons are bundled into nerves. They seem to look the same, but three types of neurons form the basic impulse transmission pathway. Starting from the top, we have the sensory receptor. In this case, it looks like we have sensory receptors in the skin. They could be pressure receptors or thermoreceptors that will determine changes in temperature. Then as we move along toward the left, we end up having our sensory neuron. The sensory neuron transmits the impulse to the central nervous system. The interneuron are the nerves of the central nervous system. Then at the bottom, as we move right, we get into the motor neuron, which transmits the impulse from the central nervous system. And finally, the effector cell, and this converts the nerve impulse into an activity. Muscle movement in this image here, or it could be glandular secretion. So the sensory receptor then are modified neurons that convert a physical stimulus to a nerve impulse. This will be discussed a little bit more in the following chapter on sensory perception. Sensory receptors can be pressure receptors for touch, photoreceptors for vision, mechanoreceptors for hearing, or chemoreceptors for the sense of smell and taste, and so on. Sensory neuron. This is the nerve that transmits the impulse to the central nervous system. Their appearance differs from the motor neurons. Their cell body is partway down the length of the axon. And the interneuron, found in the central nervous system, it processes incoming sensory information and relays outgoing motor information. They act as a link between the sensory and the motor neurons, whereas the motor neuron transmits the impulse from the central nervous system to effector cells like muscles and glands. Again, different looking than sensory receptors, their dendrites are attached to the cell body. And the effector cell. It converts the nerve impulse into an activity. A series of biochemical activities at the axon terminals of the motor neuron cause muscle cells to contract or glands to release hormones. The basic impulse transmission pathway describes the reflex arc. It uses fewer neurons for faster neural transmission, and it doesn't depend on the brain for interpretation of incoming sensory information and deciding on and releasing appropriate action. Reflexes are useful for defensive actions and blinking and walking. So to summarize the reflex arc, it uses fewer neurons for a faster response time, as quick as 50 milliseconds from stimulus to response. It doesn't depend on the sensory interpretation and response centers of the brain, which is why you would feel the pain after withdrawing a hand from a hot iron, say.